Continue from where the introduction left off and dive deeper into the mystery. This section should provide background and context about the main character's recent activities, relationships, and any events that might explain why they are in this situation. Slowly introduce red herrings and potential suspects to keep the audience guessing. Maintain the suspenseful tone and build tension without revealing too much. Keep the wording natural and engaging, ensuring it flows seamlessly. Avoid any headings, one-line statements, or short sentences. Stick to large paragraphs only. Keep the audience hooked by adding more layers of uncertainty. Write the content by targeting U.S. audience. Use the keywords which are trending on YouTube search. Continue from where the introduction left off and dive deeper into the mystery. This section should provide background and context about the main character's recent activities, relationships, and any events that might explain why they are in this situation. Slowly introduce red herrings and potential suspects to keep the audience guessing. Maintain the suspenseful tone and build tension without revealing too much. Keep the wording natural and engaging, ensuring it flows seamlessly. Avoid any headings, one-line statements, or short sentences. Stick to large paragraphs only. Keep the audience hooked by adding more layers of uncertainty. Write the content by targeting U.S. audience. Use the keywords which are trending on YouTube search. It started like any other quiet night on patrol. The kind of night that lulls you into thinking evil sleeps. A routine welfare check in a sleepy American neighborhood. The type where front lawns are mowed just right, porch lights glow with artificial safety, and nobody ever expects the horror waiting just behind a locked front door. But what officers found when they stepped into that home would haunt them forever. What began as a simple knock turned into the kind of nightmare no training manual could prepare them for. A discovery so shocking, so deeply disturbing, it left hardened officers shaken to their core. They weren't just responding to a call, they were walking straight into the darkest chapter of someone's life. And you're about to hear the truth behind it all. If you think you've heard terrifying true crime stories before, think again, because this one tops the most disturbing cases law enforcement has ever seen. And hey, before we go any further, let me say this. I know you clicked on this video because something inside you needs to know. You're here because that title pulled you in, and trust me, the answer to what those officers found, the truth behind that horrifying call, is coming. You will get the answer you came for. But to understand the depths of what really happened, we've got to go back to the beginning. I'm not going to leave you hanging like other videos that promise everything and deliver nothing. This one's different. You and I, we're in this together. I'm going to walk you through every twist, every reveal, and every hidden layer of this case until you see exactly what they saw, until you feel what they felt. Just promise me you'll stick with me until the very end. Because if you stop watching halfway through, you won't just miss out on the answers, you'll miss the moment where everything snaps into place. The moment that changes everything. Now, let's set the scene. The town itself. Quiet, forgettable, the kind of place you'd pass through on your way to somewhere more interesting. You've seen it before. Rows of tidy houses, kids riding bikes on cracked sidewalks, dogs barking behind fences, neighbors waving from porches. But underneath all that small-town charm, something was festering. The kind of darkness no one talks about. The kind of pain people hide behind smiles and friendly hellos. And on this particular evening, it all came spilling out. The call came from a concerned neighbor. They hadn't seen the woman who lived at the end of the cul-de-sac in days. Mail was piling up. Lights on at strange hours. No movement inside the house. They thought maybe she was sick, or worse, that she'd fallen and couldn't get up. Just a normal wellness check. That's what the officers thought they were walking into. But when Officers Daniels and Ruiz arrived at the house, things felt off. The front yard was overgrown, unusual for this homeowner. The porch light flickered like a warning. The door was locked, but no one answered their knocks. They circled the house and noticed something strange. The curtains were drawn tight, but there was a faint, unnatural glow coming from the living room window. That's when instinct kicked in. Something wasn't right. And in law enforcement, when your gut tells you something's wrong, you listen. They called for backup, then breached the door. What they found inside, it wasn't just disturbing, it was unspeakable. The kind of scene that doesn't just live in your memory, it infects it. I want you to take a moment and picture this. You're walking into a house where everything feels wrong. The air is heavy, thick with decay. The lights are dim, casting strange shadows on the walls. There's a smell, not strong but sharp, like something that shouldn't be there. Furniture is overturned. There are strange markings on the floor. And silence. Absolute silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that screams danger. Then, as they moved toward the back of the house, they found a door, partially open, with something just barely visible through the gap. That's when the first officer froze. And what they saw when they pushed that door open would change the course of the entire investigation. Because behind that door was a scene so grotesque, so meticulously staged, it was clear. This wasn't an accident. This was something much, much darker. And here's where the real questions begin. Who was responsible? Was the missing woman a victim? Or something else entirely? What clues did the officers uncover in that room that pointed to something far more sinister than they could have imagined? And why did one of them walk out of that house and immediately request psychiatric leave? You see, this isn't just about a crime. It's about the psychology of evil. It's about what happens when someone takes obsession to a level so extreme, it warps reality itself. This story is going to pull you in, not just because it's shocking, but because it makes you question how well you really know the people around you. Your neighbors, your family, even yourself. As we dive deeper, you're going to meet key players in this twisted tale. There's Officer Daniels, a seasoned cop known for his calm under pressure, now battling the images he can't unsee. Officer Ruiz, younger, newer, still holding on to the belief that most people are good, or at least used to. And then there's her, the woman at the center of it all. A woman whose life, on the surface, seemed perfectly normal. Until investigators started peeling back the layers and realized nothing about her life made sense. Her past, her behavior, the things hidden in her home, and eventually, the terrifying truth she tried to bury in silence. This case didn't just challenge the officers who responded, it broke them in ways they never expected. It also drew in the FBI, a forensic psychologist, and a media circus that turned their small town into ground zero for America's newest obsession, a real-life horror story unfolding in real time. But I want you to hear it all the way it happened, slowly, painfully, like peeling off a bandage that hides a wound too deep to heal. You'll hear from people who knew her. You'll hear about the strange coincidences that led to her unraveling. And you'll see how one crucial piece of evidence, a chilling voicemail she never meant anyone to hear, blew the entire case wide open. That's coming later. You just need to stick with me. And believe me, you'll be glad you did. Because once the final piece falls into place, everything you think you know about this case will change. Still here? Good. That means you're ready to go deeper. Because this story, it's not just another crime. It's a descent into madness. It's about what happens when the darkness we all try to hide finally breaks loose. And it's about the officers who walked straight into that darkness, hoping to bring back the light, and realizing too late that some places don't want to be saved. So get comfortable. Or maybe don't. Because the next chapter of the story will take us into the hidden room. The one no one was supposed to find. The one with the walls covered in photographs. And something else. Something no one could explain. And just when investigators thought they'd seen it all, when they believed they'd uncovered the worst of it, they opened a small box tucked away in the back of a closet. That's when everything changed. Would you like me to continue with the next section of the story, or are you planning to use this as the full intro? Her name was Abigail Keller, 41 years old, a substitute teacher at the local middle school and an amateur gardener who often posted pictures of her roses on Facebook. She lived alone, drove a silver sedan with a broken taillight, and had no immediate family nearby. At least, not anymore. When officers began digging into her background, the facade started to crack. She had recently taken an unexplained leave of absence from work, citing personal reasons, and those who knew her mentioned she had grown increasingly withdrawn over the past few months. To the outside world, she was quiet, polite, and always kept to herself. The kind of person people described with those vague, almost meaningless phrases like, "she seemed normal," or "we never had any trouble with her." Inside that box was more than just evidence. It was a doorway into the fractured mind of a woman the neighborhood barely knew. Some said they thought she was grieving. Others suspected she was just tired of the world. No one, not a single person, thought she was dangerous. And that's what made the truth so terrifying, because the signs were there, hiding in plain sight, and no one saw them until it was far too late. Investigators combed through her home, carefully cataloging every strange item, every eerie photograph, every piece of scribbled paper they found scattered throughout the house. And what emerged from that search was a deeply disturbing portrait of a woman unraveling from the inside. The box they found tucked away in the back of her closet held dozens of Polaroids, images of unfamiliar people, mostly women, many of whom have yet to be identified. Some of the photos were dated and labeled with names. Others were left blank, like a memory only Abigail could decode. There were notes, too. Pages torn from journals filled with erratic handwriting, paranoid thoughts, and increasingly dark entries about the visitors, the watchers, and the sacrifice. What initially looked like the behavior of someone deeply mentally unwell began to take on a more calculated, sinister edge. Because some of the names she wrote down, at least two of them, matched missing persons cases from neighboring states. That changed everything. This wasn't just an isolated tragedy anymore. This was something much bigger, possibly much deadlier. As detectives traced Abigail's last known activities, the mystery deepened. Security footage from a local hardware store showed her purchasing rope, duct tape, and plastic sheeting just weeks before the welfare call. A red flag, certainly, but not enough on its own to paint a complete picture. More troubling was the footage from a nearby rest stop that showed her interacting with a young woman who was reported missing just days later. The girl was never seen again. But here's where it gets even stranger. There's no record of that rest stop conversation in any formal investigation report until now. It was missed, overlooked, and it wasn't until detectives re-reviewed hours of footage that they stumbled across that blurry, 30-second exchange. Abigail smiled, offered the girl something, maybe directions, maybe a ride, and the girl hesitated before following her out of frame. That's all we know. That one piece of grainy footage is the only thread connecting Abigail to something far darker than a mental breakdown. It's the kind of clue that raises more questions than it answers. But here's the twist. While all eyes were turning to Abigail, another name started popping up. Jeremy Flynn, a man in his late 40s who lived 2 blocks away and who, according to several neighbors, had been seen visiting Abigail's house late at night. Flynn, a former EMT with a patchy work history and a sealed juvenile record, immediately became a person of interest. He was quiet, awkward, the type of man who always looked a little too long at people and never quite fit in. He denied any involvement, of course. Claimed he was just helping Abigail with some electrical work. Said she paid him in cash and herbal tea. But when detectives searched his property, they found a burner phone with several encrypted messages, many of them from a number registered under a fake name. Messages that hinted at plans, at deliveries, and at something referred to only as the transition. Still, without context, the texts were meaningless. But they were enough to cast serious doubt on Jeremy's story, and they opened a new avenue of investigation that detectives couldn't ignore. Then there was the ex-boyfriend, Marcus Langston. He and Abigail had dated almost a decade earlier, but their breakup was described by those close to them as toxic, even violent. A restraining order had been filed against Marcus at one point, later dropped. When reached for questioning, Marcus appeared calm, even cooperative. Claimed he hadn't spoken to Abigail in years. But the records showed something different. Just 3 months before the discovery, Abigail had reported a break-in at her home. No forced entry, nothing stolen, just objects moved around, lights left on, food missing from the fridge. She told the responding officer she believed someone was entering her home while she slept. Nothing came of the report, but it made Marcus' sudden reappearance in her online search history all the more alarming. Investigators are still piecing together whether it was fear, guilt, or obsession that tied him to the events that followed. But his name remains in the file, underlined, circled, and marked with a question. And still, the question that kept haunting investigators, Was Abigail Keller a victim of manipulation, driven to the edge by someone pulling strings from the shadows? Or was she the mastermind behind something even more chilling than anyone imagined? The community didn't know what to believe. Some insisted she was mentally ill, pushed beyond reason by trauma and paranoia. Others were convinced she was hiding something, that the sweet, gentle persona she wore in public was just a mask. A mask that had finally slipped. But the longer detectives dug, the more contradictions they uncovered. In one moment, they'd find clues pointing to her as the orchestrator of something monstrous. In the next, they'd uncover evidence that made her look like a pawn in someone else's twisted game. Red herrings were everywhere. A blood-stained letter with no matching fingerprints. A man seen running from her backyard days before the call, but never identified. A locked drawer containing children's drawings, none of which could be traced back to any known child. This case was no longer just about what was found in that room. It was about the invisible threads connecting Abigail's unraveling mind to a network of secrets that stretched far beyond her front door. And with every new piece of evidence, the line between guilt and innocence grew blurrier. Was she luring people into her home for reasons only she understood? Or was someone using her house as a dumping ground, hiding behind her isolation to conceal their crimes? Could Jeremy Flynn and Marcus Langston be working together, or were they both victims of Abigail's delusions? And most unsettling of all, were there more victims out there, their stories buried under years of silence and oversight? These were the questions no one wanted to ask out loud, because asking meant accepting that the truth might be even worse than anyone feared. And just when detectives thought they had reached the limits of what Abigail's home could reveal, a forensic team discovered something behind a false wall in the basement. Something alive. Would you like me to continue with the next section and build toward the shocking midpoint twist? What they found behind that wall wasn't what anyone expected, not another body, not some hidden stash of evidence, but something worse in a way. It was a child. A girl, no older than 7 or 8, filthy, trembling, and unable to speak. She was alive, barely, tucked away in a small, makeshift room with no light, no windows, and a mattress stained with years of filth. Her eyes were wide with a fear that seemed to go beyond anything physical. Whatever had happened to her, and whoever had put her there, had stolen more than just her voice. It had taken her sense of safety, her ability to trust. The moment detectives pulled her from that hidden room, the tone of the investigation shifted. This was no longer just about solving a mystery. Now it was about protecting someone fragile, someone whose very existence raised terrifying new questions. Who was this girl? How long had she been there? And more importantly, how had no one noticed? Just as they were preparing to run DNA tests and circulate the girl's image through the missing persons database, a major setback struck. The physical evidence from the basement, the torn blanket, the small shoes, even the crayon drawings found under the mattress, vanished from the evidence locker overnight. No signs of forced entry, no camera footage, nothing. It was as if the items had simply evaporated. This wasn't a careless mistake. This was intentional. Someone didn't want that girl's identity discovered, and they had access to areas no outsider should. That realization sent chills through the department. If someone on the inside was tampering with the case, the entire investigation could collapse before the truth ever came to light. The girl remained in protective custody, still silent, still afraid, and the detectives were suddenly forced to question everyone, even each other. That's when the anonymous warning arrived. It came in the form of a typed letter, postmarked from a neighboring town, with no return address. Inside, just a few words: "Stop looking, or the next one won't be found alive." It was a threat, but more than that, it was confirmation. Confirmation that someone out there was still watching, still playing their game, and willing to escalate if pushed. The lead detective on the case, Daniel Reese, had seen some dark things in his 20 years on the force, but this shook him. He wasn't used to threats that felt this personal. And this wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about power. Someone was trying to control the narrative, to manipulate what was seen, what was known, and who got too close. And maybe someone already had. Because as Reese dove deeper, He started noticing gaps in Abigail Keller's past, years where her activity seemed to vanish entirely. No employment records, no rental history, not even a utility bill. Like she'd just disappeared from the system for close to 3 years. The working theory had been that she was grieving a loss, recovering from trauma, but the reality was more disturbing. A quiet whistleblower from a neighboring precinct hinted at a missing file. Something involving Abigail from back in 2012, a case sealed under suspicious circumstances involving a missing foster child and a group home that was later shut down for ethical violations. But every attempt to access those records hit a wall. Digital files were corrupted. Paper files were misplaced. No one could or would talk. The deeper Reese pushed, the more resistance he met. And then, something even more unexpected happened. Jeremy Flynn, the neighbor with the encrypted burner phone, was attacked in his own home. Someone broke in, beat him unconscious, and left him bleeding in his bathtub. No signs of robbery, nothing stolen, just a brutal warning. And on the bathroom mirror, scrawled in blood, were the words, "She told you, didn't she?" Flynn survived, but his story changed. Now he claimed that Abigail had confessed something horrifying to him just weeks before she was found catatonic. He said she talked about repaying a debt, about children that must be returned, and about the ones watching from the forest. At first, Reese dismissed it as the rantings of a man desperate to avoid suspicion. But something about Flynn's fear, something about the panic in his voice, felt real. Like he'd stumbled into something way over his head and was trying to claw his way out. And then came the betrayal. One of Reese's own team members, Detective Mallory James, was caught deleting surveillance footage from the night the evidence disappeared. Footage that might have shown who entered the locker. When confronted, she claimed it was a mistake, that she was trying to free up space on the server. But it didn't add up. Mallory had been acting strangely for weeks. Missing briefings, ignoring calls, taking long, unexplained trips out of town. She said she was overwhelmed by the case, but Reese wasn't buying it. And when he pulled her service records, he found something chilling. Mallory had once worked in that same group home where Abigail had vanished years earlier. Her name appeared on the original staff roster, right next to the former director who died in a fire that was later ruled suspicious, but never investigated. Coincidence? Maybe. But in a case like this, coincidences are often just clues hiding in plain sight. Now Reese was surrounded by uncertainty. He didn't know who to trust. The missing evidence, the silent girl, the corrupt officer, the threatening letter, it all pointed to something larger, something organized. A network? A cult? A ring? Theories were starting to spiral, and time was running out. Because while detectives scrambled for answers, the girl, still too traumatized to speak, began drawing again. This time, she drew a house. One that no one recognized. A house with a red door. A swing in the front yard. And 3 figures standing outside it. One of them looked a lot like Mallory. But before Reese could act, Mallory disappeared. Vanished without a trace. And within 48 hours, another child went missing. Would you like me to continue with the next section and lead into the shocking revelation that ties all the hidden clues together? You said, the moment news broke that another child had gone missing, this time a boy from a nearby suburb, just 6 years old, panic rippled through the town like a fast-moving fire. It wasn't just the eerie similarity to the first victim that made this feel personal. It was the fact that the boy's mother, Vanessa Trent, was once Abigail Keller's best friend. They had grown up just blocks apart, played on the same soccer team in high school, even shared a dorm in college for a year before losing touch. No one had connected them before until now. And when detectives questioned Vanessa, her response was chillingly familiar. She claimed to have recently received a letter. No envelope, no return address, just a sheet of paper slipped under her door one night, bearing the same haunting message, "Stop looking, or the next one won't be found alive." The only problem was, Vanessa wasn't involved in the investigation. She wasn't looking for anything.
Or so she said.
Detective Reese knew this couldn't be coincidence anymore. The letters, the missing children, the erased files, it was all part of a strategy. Someone was orchestrating this with precision, choosing victims and players like pieces on a chessboard. But what disturbed Reese even more was the new piece of evidence that showed up in the strangest place imaginable. A small, dusty music box, identical to one found near Abigail's basement, turned up inside a church donation bin across town. It played the same haunting melody, off-key and mechanical, but this time, inside the box wasn't a broken trinket or a child's bracelet. It was a memory card. Encrypted, yes, but not beyond reach. Once the tech team finally cracked it, what they found nearly halted the investigation in its tracks. The footage was grainy, shot with a shaky handheld camera, time-stamped 2 weeks before Abigail was discovered. In it, a child, possibly the girl from the basement, sat at a table with 2 adults. One of them wore a mask, the other sat just outside of view, their voice distorted. They were reading stories out loud, calm and eerily nurturing, like nothing was wrong. But it was what happened at the end of the video that disturbed the entire room. The adult leaned forward and whispered to the child, "They'll come looking for you soon."
Just like they did last time.
"And you'll be ready, won't you?" The child nodded. Not scared. Almost proud. The implications were terrifying. Had she been coached? Was she really a victim? Or was there something more to her silence? The team began revisiting every assumption. What if Abigail hadn't rescued the girl, but taken her in willingly? What if the person they thought was a savior had been part of the mechanism all along? Reese didn't want to believe it, but every time they peeled back another layer, it felt like someone else was rewriting the truth just ahead of them. And then, something else changed everything. A janitor at a local elementary school came forward with a strange story. He said he found another letter in a student's locker. The letter had no name, no address, just a line that read, "Red doors lead to red truths." Alongside it was a photograph. A blurry image showing Abigail and Vanessa together in what looked like the same house the little girl had drawn. A red door clearly visible behind them. But the date printed on the photo? It was from just 8 months ago. That should have been impossible. Abigail had been off the grid. Vanessa claimed they hadn't spoken in years. The timeline was all wrong, and yet the photo was real. That meant someone was lying. Someone was actively covering their tracks. And now, Vanessa wasn't just a grieving mother.
She was a suspect.
Reese confronted her, hoping to catch a tell, a misstep, anything that might confirm the growing suspicion, but she didn't break. She looked him dead in the eyes and asked him something that flipped the case on its head. "Do you know what Project Nesting Ground is?" Reese had never heard of it. Neither had anyone else in the room. But the way Vanessa said it, like it was something sacred and dangerous, made every hair on his neck stand on end. She wouldn't explain further. Only said, "You're not chasing a person, detective. You're chasing a system." That phrase stuck with Reese for days. A system. Something organized, institutional, protected. Something people would kill to keep secret. He ordered his team to dig deep into anything tied to Project Nesting Ground, and that's when a decades-old government file surfaced. Most of it was redacted, but enough remained to suggest that it was a covert foster placement program run by a private organization that once had contracts with the Department of Health and Human Services. The goal was listed as behavioral monitoring and adaptive conditioning. The words sent a chill through everyone. This wasn't a simple kidnapping case anymore. It was bigger, sprawling, systemic, and maybe even covered up by people in power. And then, just as they were starting to connect the dots, the lead tech analyst on the memory card, Jamal Carter, went missing. His car was found abandoned near a wildlife preserve, engines still running, laptop left in the passenger seat. No signs of a struggle, no signs of him. But the last file he accessed before vanishing was a hidden video buried deep in the card's metadata. The file name? Nest_hatch_final, MP4. It still hasn't been opened. Do you want me to continue with the next part, where everything starts unraveling and the real enemy finally begins to reveal themselves? Detective Reese had always prided himself on being able to separate his work from his personal life. Over the years, he'd seen bodies mangled in ways the human mind wasn't built to comprehend, interviewed sociopaths who smiled while describing acts of unthinkable cruelty, and stood in courtrooms testifying about things that haunted his dreams long after the cases were closed. But this was different. This wasn't something he could walk away from at the end of the day. It had crawled its way out of the file folders and crime scenes and wedged itself into his life. It started subtly at first. Reese noticed a black SUV parked just down the street from his apartment 3 nights in a row. The license plate didn't register with any known agency or database, and when he approached it one evening with his badge in hand, the vehicle pulled away slowly and disappeared before he could get a solid look at the driver. He told himself it was just coincidence. Maybe a neighbor had a new car. Maybe he was being paranoid. But deep down, he knew better. It escalated quickly after that. One morning, Reese woke up to find his front door slightly ajar. Nothing stolen, nothing obviously disturbed, except for one thing. A photograph had been left on his kitchen counter. It was old, faded, clearly taken years ago, showing Reese's younger sister, Sarah, who'd been missing for over 2 decades. Her disappearance was the very reason he'd joined the force in the first place, the unsolved case that had haunted his family since he was just a teenager. But here she was, unmistakably her, standing next to a man whose face was scratched out with red ink, and in the background, barely visible, was that same red door.
The door from the drawing.
The door from the photograph of Abigail and Vanessa. He couldn't make sense of it. How did they have this photo? Why leave it now? And why was it left in his home, which he locked religiously every night? He didn't sleep after that. He barely ate. Every knock on the door sent his pulse racing. Every call from an unknown number went unanswered. Reese, a man known for keeping his composure under fire, was unraveling. His thoughts raced constantly, circling back to people he trusted, wondering if any of them were feeding information to the ones behind all this. Mallory's betrayal had set off a chain reaction of doubt that he couldn't shut down. Had she acted alone? Was she just a pawn like him? Or something worse, something willingly complicit? And what about Vanessa? She was either a terrified mother caught in a deadly web or a master manipulator playing both sides of a dangerous game. The scariest part was that Reese couldn't even trust his own instincts anymore. His gut had never failed him before, but now it whispered things he wasn't ready to believe. That this case had never been about Abigail or even the missing children. It had been about him all along. The emotional weight of the revelation was crushing. Every call from an unknown number went unanswered. Reese, a man known for keeping his composure under fire, was unraveling. Was she just a pawn like him, or something worse, something willingly complicit? And what about Vanessa? She was either a terrified mother caught in a deadly web or a master manipulator playing both sides of a dangerous game. The scariest part was that Reese couldn't even trust his own instincts anymore. His gut had never failed him before, but now it whispered things he wasn't ready to believe. That this case had never been about Abigail or even the missing children. It had been about him all along. The emotional weight of the revelation was crushing. His thoughts raced constantly, circling back to people he trusted, wondering if any of them were feeding information to the ones behind all this. Mallory's betrayal had set off a chain reaction of doubt that he couldn't shut down. Had she acted alone? If someone had Sarah's photo, if they knew things only someone from his past could possibly know, then this wasn't just professional. This was deeply personal. He dug back through his old files, through dusty boxes in his closet filled with case notes from when he was fresh on the force and still driven by grief. There, tucked into one of the folders from his earliest days, he found something he hadn't noticed before. A copy of a missing persons report filed anonymously just 2 weeks after Sarah vanished. The description wasn't a perfect match, but one detail stuck out. The girl was said to have a small, crescent-shaped scar on her shoulder, just like Sarah had after falling from their backyard swing set when they were kids. The girl in the report was never found, but the address where she was last seen matched a property owned by one of the same shell companies tied to Project Nesting Ground. That was the breaking point for Reese. He realized he hadn't just stumbled into this mystery, he'd been pulled into it. Lured in, step by step, through a case that had been constructed to trigger his obsession, to force him to dig until he reached the layer they wanted him to see. Someone was watching his every move, testing how far he'd go, how much he'd sacrifice. And they were using the thing he cared about most, his sister, to keep him digging deeper. It was no longer about solving a crime. It was about surviving whatever darkness was being unearthed. And then came the message that shattered any illusion of control he still had. It wasn't another letter. It wasn't a photo. It was a voice, familiar, trembling, barely a whisper. Left on his voicemail at 3:06 a.m. Danny, I'm sorry. I tried to leave. I tried. They're watching. You have to stop. Please stop. The voice was unmistakable. It was Sarah, or someone who knew her well enough to fake it. Reese dropped the phone. His knees buckled. The weight of it all, 20 years of unanswered questions, the ghosts of every cold case he'd ever worked, the faces of those missing children, came crashing down. If that was truly Sarah, then she was alive. If it wasn't, then someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to impersonate her voice. Either possibility was horrifying. And now, with no backup, no one left to trust, and nowhere to turn, Reese had to make a choice. Walk away before he lost himself completely, or follow the next clue that had just been delivered with the morning mail. A new envelope. Inside it, a single GPS coordinate. And beneath it, a sentence that changed everything. She never left the house. Do you want me to keep going and reveal where that coordinate leads, and what shocking truth lies hidden at the end of that path? Reese had spent his entire career chasing answers, cutting through lies, half-truths, and fear to find the one version of the story that lined up with the evidence. But this time, the story he thought he was following had been flipped on its head, and every assumption he'd made now seemed like a carefully placed trap. The GPS coordinates from the envelope led him deep into the woods outside an abandoned property once owned by a now-defunct church organization linked to several missing persons cases from the late 90s. The house was little more than a collapsed structure strangled by vines and silence. At first glance, it appeared empty, long forgotten. But hidden beneath the rotting floorboards of the main hall was a trapdoor, and behind it a narrow stairwell that spiraled into a cold, concrete bunker lit only by flickering bulbs and the hum of old generators. It was clear someone had been using this space recently. Reese's stomach twisted as he moved further in, each step echoing like a countdown. There were documents pinned to the walls, photos, timelines, names, including his own, and in the center of the room, resting on a table, was an old recording device. The moment Reese pressed play, a voice filled the room. Calm, rehearsed. It belonged to someone he hadn't heard from in years. Captain Monroe, the retired head of homicide who trained Reese when he was a rookie. The man who had vanished quietly from the department after a scandal involving evidence tampering in a high-profile child trafficking case, one that never saw the light of day because key records were sealed. If you're hearing this, then you've gotten too close, and I'm sorry, the voice said. This isn't about Abigail. It was never about her. She's just the latest symbol. You're chasing shadows because someone wanted you to. But the truth, it was always close. Closer than you wanted to believe. Reese stood frozen as the audio continued. Monroe detailed a covert operation that spanned nearly 15 years, built under the guise of protecting children, but slowly corrupted into something much darker. An organization within law enforcement, one that filtered, redirected, and in some cases, buried cases that risked exposing higher powers. Monroe hadn't left the force in disgrace. He'd been forced out because he tried to go public. And Reese had unknowingly picked up where he left off. But the part that truly shattered Reese's grip on reality came at the end of the tape. You were part of the program too, Danny. You just don't remember. They made sure of that. His blood went cold. His knees buckled. The air in the bunker grew thick, suffocating. Everything blurred together. Sarah's disappearance, the encrypted files, Mallory's betrayal, the red door. None of it was random. Reese wasn't just a detective chasing a case. He was the case. The same people who had trained him, who had guided his career, had also watched him closely, manipulating his assignments, his cases, even his personal life. His entire career had been a controlled environment to see what he would do when confronted with pieces of a past that had been hidden from him for a reason. They hadn't counted on his persistence. Or maybe they had. And then, just as Reese began to process the unthinkable, his phone rang. Was she just a pawn like him? Or something worse, something willingly complicit? And what about Vanessa? She was either a terrified mother caught in a deadly web or a master manipulator playing both sides of a dangerous game. The scariest part was that Reese couldn't even trust his own instincts anymore. His gut had never failed him before, but now it whispered things he wasn't ready to believe. That this case had never been about Abigail, or even the missing children. It had been about him all along. The emotional weight of the revelation was crushing. His thoughts raced constantly, circling back to people he trusted, wondering if any of them were feeding information to the ones behind all this. Mallory's betrayal had set off a chain reaction of doubt that he couldn't shut down. Had she acted alone? If someone had Sarah's photo, if they knew things only someone from his past could possibly know, then this wasn't just professional. This was deeply personal. He dug back through his old files, through dusty boxes in his closet filled with case notes from when he was fresh on the force and still driven by grief. There, tucked into one of the folders from his earliest days, he found something he hadn't noticed before, a copy of a missing persons report filed anonymously just 2 weeks after Sarah vanished. The description wasn't a perfect match, but one detail stuck out. The girl was said to have a small, crescent-shaped scar on her shoulder, just like Sarah had after falling from their backyard swing set when they were kids. The girl in the report was never found, but the address where she was last seen matched a property owned by one of the same shell companies tied to Project Nesting Ground. That was the breaking point for Reese. He realized he hadn't just stumbled into this mystery, he'd been pulled into it. Lured in step by step, through a case that had been constructed to trigger his obsession, to force him to dig until he reached the layer they wanted him to see. Someone was watching his every move, testing how far he'd go, how much he'd sacrifice. And they were using the thing he cared about most, his sister, to keep him digging deeper. It was no longer about solving a crime. It was about surviving whatever darkness was being unearthed. And then came the message that shattered any illusion of control he still had. It wasn't another letter. It wasn't a photo. It was a voice, familiar, trembling, barely a whisper. Left on his voicemail at 3:06 a.m. Danny.
I'm sorry.
I tried to leave. I tried. They're watching. You have to stop.
Please stop.
The voice was unmistakable. It was Sarah. Or someone who knew her well enough to fake it. Reese dropped the phone. His knees buckled. The weight of it all, 20 years of unanswered questions, the ghosts of every cold case he'd ever worked, the faces of those missing children, came crashing down. If that was truly Sarah, then she was alive. If it wasn't, then someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to impersonate her voice. Either possibility was horrifying. And now, with no backup, no one left to trust, and nowhere to turn, Reese had to make a choice. Walk away before he lost himself completely, or follow the next clue that had just been delivered with the morning mail. A new envelope. Inside it, a single GPS coordinate. And beneath it, a sentence that changed everything. She never left the house. Do you want me to keep going and reveal where that coordinate leads, and what shocking truth lies hidden at the end of that path? Reese had spent his entire career chasing answers, cutting through lies, half-truths, and fear to find the one version of the story that lined up with the evidence. But this time, the story he thought he was following had been flipped on its head, and every assumption he'd made now seemed like a carefully placed trap. The GPS coordinates from the envelope led him deep into the woods outside an abandoned property once owned by a now-defunct church organization linked to several missing persons cases from the late 90s. The house was little more than a collapsed structure strangled by vines and silence. At first glance, it appeared empty, long forgotten. But hidden beneath the rotting floorboards of the main hall was a trapdoor, and behind it, a narrow stairwell that spiraled into a cold, concrete bunker lit only by flickering bulbs and the hum of old generators. It was clear someone had been using this space recently. Reese's stomach twisted as he moved further in, each step echoing like a countdown. There were documents pinned to the walls, photos, timelines, names, including his own, and in the center of the room, resting on a table, was an old recording device. The moment Reese pressed play, a voice filled the room. Calm, rehearsed. It belonged to someone he hadn't heard from in years. Captain Monroe, the retired head of homicide who trained Reese when he was a rookie. The man who had vanished quietly from the department after a scandal involving evidence tampering in a high-profile child trafficking case, one that never saw the light of day because key records were sealed. "If you're hearing this, then you've gotten too close, and I'm sorry," the voice said. "This isn't about Abigail. It was never about her. She's just the latest symbol. You're chasing shadows because someone wanted you to. But the truth, it was always close. Closer than you wanted to believe." Reese stood frozen as the audio continued. Monroe detailed a covert operation that spanned nearly 15 years, built under the guise of protecting children but slowly corrupted into something much darker. An organization within law enforcement, one that filtered, redirected, and in some cases, buried cases that risked exposing higher powers. Monroe hadn't left the force in disgrace. He'd been forced out because he tried to go public. And Reese had unknowingly picked up where he left off. But the part that truly shattered Reese's grip on reality came at the end of the tape. "You were part of the program too, Danny. You just don't remember. They made sure of that." His blood went cold. His knees buckled. The air in the bunker grew thick, suffocating. Everything blurred together. Sarah's disappearance, the encrypted files, Mallory's betrayal, the red door. None of it was random. Reese wasn't just a detective chasing a case. He was the case. The same people who had trained him, who had guided his career, had also watched him closely, manipulating his assignments, his cases, even his personal life. His entire career had been a controlled environment to see what he would do when confronted with pieces of a past that had been hidden from him for a reason. They hadn't counted on his persistence. Or maybe they had. And then, just as Reese began to process the unthinkable, his phone rang. It was Mallory. Against all reason, he answered. "I found something," she whispered, her voice low, urgent. "It's about Sarah. She's not who you think she is. Meet me where it all began." Reese didn't ask questions. He didn't have the breath. He climbed out of the bunker, heart racing, head spinning. Because where it all began wasn't his apartment, or the station, or even the abandoned house with the red door. It was the foster home he and Sarah were placed in for 6 months after their parents' car accident, before she vanished without a trace. A place he hadn't spoken of in decades because he hadn't remembered it until now. The past wasn't buried. It was waiting. And the worst part? He wasn't sure if he wanted to remember what came next. "Oh, you want me to continue and reveal what Mallory knows and who Sarah really is?" "You said." The ride to the foster home felt like a descent into another lifetime, a distant, half-buried version of himself Reese had spent years trying to forget. The roads were darker than he remembered, the streetlights fewer, flickering like they too were afraid to shine too bright on the truth that was clawing its way to the surface. Mallory was already there when he arrived, leaning against her car, arms crossed, face pale, eyes red like she hadn't slept in days. The moment Reese stepped out of his vehicle, she didn't speak. She just handed him a folder, trembling in her hands, and turned away like she couldn't bear to watch him open it. Inside were documents, case files, medical records, photos of children, lists of names, all tied to a covert psychological study run out of the very foster home they were standing in front of. A study funded by a private intelligence contractor, backed in part by a forgotten arm of the federal government. But that wasn't the worst part. The name at the top of the subject list was his. Right beneath it, Sarah Monroe. Sarah hadn't disappeared by accident. She'd been extracted, chosen, and she hadn't just survived. She'd become part of it. Her video ended with a chilling line. "I stayed because I had to. You were never supposed to wake up. But now you have, and they'll come for you like they came for the others. This isn't about us anymore. It's bigger. Much bigger." The knock on his door came less than 5 minutes later. Reese grabbed the flash drive and shoved it into his pocket, heart pounding as he backed away from the entrance. The knock came again, louder this time. He ducked into the hallway and took the fire escape down 2 flights before vanishing into the early morning fog. He didn't need to check who it was. He already knew. They'd been tracking him ever since he accessed the bunker.
Since he refused to walk away.
And now they were closing in. But the real shock came when he reached the safe house Mallory had secured for emergencies. He walked in expecting her. Instead, he found someone else. Detective Harper. His mentor. His friend. The one person left in his life he thought he could trust unconditionally. Except Harper wasn't there to help him. He was there to stop him. Reese froze when Harper raised his hands, not in surrender, but as if to signal control. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," he said quietly. "You've gotten too close. We wanted you to piece things together, just not this fast. It was supposed to be gradual, manageable." Reese felt like he'd been hit in the chest. "You knew?" he asked, disbelief and rage tangled in his voice. Harper sighed, almost with pity. "We all did. You think you made detective on your own? You think the cases you solved were accidents? You were monitored from day one. Groomed. We wanted to see how far someone like you would go before they snapped. But you're not following protocol anymore, Danny. You're rewriting the story, and that makes you dangerous." Reese didn't wait for another word. He grabbed the flash drive and bolted out the back. Harper didn't chase him. He didn't need to. Reese knew now that the conspiracy wasn't some ghost operation hidden in the shadows. It was in plain sight, embedded in the very institutions he'd spent his life serving. The department, the state, the system. This wasn't about Sarah anymore. It wasn't about his childhood. This was about a machine that created its own chaos, manipulated trauma, and turned pain into control. And now, Reese wasn't just a rogue detective. He was a threat to everything they'd built. The urgency became suffocating. He had to get the video out, go public, leak everything. But who could he trust? The media? They were part of the filter. Internal affairs? Already compromised. His only option was a former journalist turned whistleblower advocate named Evan Callahan, someone Mallory had worked with briefly when trying to uncover corruption within state-run shelters. Reese arranged to meet him under an overpass just outside the city, a place where cell signals couldn't penetrate. But as he waited, his phone vibrated. A single text from a blocked number appeared on screen. "Don't trust Callahan. He's one of us." And as Reese looked up, headlights appeared in the distance. More than one car. He wasn't sure who sent the message. But in that moment, it didn't matter. He was already out of time. Should I continue and show whether Reese risks exposing the truth, or walks into the trap knowing it might be his only chance to end the nightmare? The wind howled beneath the overpass as Reese stood frozen, eyes locked on the approaching vehicles. Each second dragged like an eternity. He knew it was a setup, but what he didn't know, what he could know, was how deep the betrayal went. He had the flash drive in his coat pocket, still warm from his grip, still loaded with damning footage, classified case files, and the recording of Sarah's message that had upended everything he believed about his past. The first car stopped 30 yards away. Doors opened. Men in suits, some familiar, others ghosts from his fragmented memory, stepped out without urgency. One of them was Callahan, the so-called whistleblower. He smiled like this was a reunion. But it was the man who exited the second vehicle that made Reese's knees weaken. Captain Monroe. Not a memory. Not a ghost. Very much alive. Monroe didn't look older. He looked untouched, like time had never dared to mark him. His presence was suffocating, commanding in that way only men who have manipulated lives for decades could be. Reese had questions, so many, but none escaped his lips. Monroe beat him to it. "I knew you'd get here, Daniel. You were always meant to." His voice was calm, almost fatherly, which made it all the more twisted. "What we built wasn't about cruelty. It was about control. Stability. You think you suffered? You were perfected." Reese couldn't breathe. The man he'd spent years idolizing, hating, grieving. He was at the center of it all. Monroe explained the program in clinical detail, like a lecture to a student. Children selected after trauma. malleable minds, broken enough to be reprogrammed. Emotional connections engineered. Sarah's disappearance?
Staged.
Her messages?
Filtered.
Every decision Reese thought he'd made of his own free will had been carefully guided by Monroe's network. Even Mallory's loyalty had been calculated. She'd been chosen not because she could protect him, but because she would drive him exactly where they needed him to go. "They'll never believe you," Monroe said with quiet finality. "You go public with that drive, and you disappear like the rest. No headlines. No story. Just another statistic no one looks into." Reese felt the weight of the world crashing on his chest, but then something shifted. One of the suited men subtly reached into his jacket, then stepped forward and tossed a phone at Reese's feet. A live stream was already running. Thousands of viewers. The audio?
Clear as day.
Everything Monroe had just said was out in the open. Reese glanced up in disbelief. It was Mallory's doing. She wasn't just a pawn. She had gone rogue. She'd routed the drive's contents to a darknet node and begun a real-time broadcast to whistleblower forums, alternative media platforms, and civilian journalist pages that couldn't be shut down with a phone call. Monroe didn't flinch. Instead, he looked at Reese with something akin to admiration. "You always were the wild card," he murmured. "But this doesn't end how you think." Then came the sound. A distant, deafening crack from above. The bridge trembled. Explosives. The support beams gave out in a thunderous roar, metal groaning like a wounded animal. Reese turned and ran with everything he had, the phone in his hand, the flash drive in his pocket, while chaos collapsed behind him. Monroe and his men vanished into the dust and wreckage like phantoms. The screen on the phone went black.
Cut.
Interrupted. Reese escaped, barely, bruised, bleeding, coughing up smoke, but alive. The city's response was predictable. A tragic accident. A failed bridge inspection. No reports of a confrontation. No acknowledgement of Monroe or the men who had surrounded him. The news cycle moved on in hours. But the broadcast had already spread. People had seen. And more importantly, someone had copied the files. Reese was forced underground, a ghost living in the cracks of a society he once served. But in whispers in digital shadows, his name lived on. The detective who exposed the unthinkable. The man who uncovered how children became weapons in a government-backed psychological war. Months later, a package arrived at an independent news outlet. No return address. Inside, a thumb drive and a photo.
Sarah.
Holding a newspaper dated 3 days ago.
Alive. Free.
Smiling, and written on the back, in shaky handwriting. "It's not over. They're building something worse." Would you like to continue and explore how Reese prepares for the next chapter, now knowing the true enemy is still out there and the fight has just begun? Weeks had passed and the world had moved on, or at least it pretended to. The bridge collapse was officially ruled a tragic engineering failure, a 1 in a million disaster no one could have predicted, but those who had followed the leak knew better. On niche forums, late-night podcasts, and viral YouTube exposés, the story lived on, fractured and debated, distorted in places, but still pulsing with a truth no one could fully suppress. Reese had vanished again, this time by choice. No more running blindly into traps, no more trusting anyone with pieces of the puzzle that cost him his peace. He found solace in anonymity, not because he wanted to disappear, but because the quiet gave him time to think, to finally look inward after being hunted, manipulated, and nearly destroyed by a system that was supposed to protect people like him. In a small cabin off the grid, surrounded by towering trees and the kind of silence that once terrified him, Reese finally unpacked the pain that had been gnawing at him since the first message from Sarah. He played it again, her voice a ghost from a life that never really existed, and this time he didn't cry, he listened. Every word, every pause. There was a deeper code buried in her tone, one that didn't belong to the woman he remembered, but to someone who had been trying to send him a message beneath the surface. As it turned out, Sarah had never stopped fighting. She had been inside the program longer than him, pulled deeper, but she had played her role so well, they led her closer to the inner workings than anyone else. The smile in the final photo wasn't one of escape, it was one of victory. She had been the real whistleblower all along. And the drive Reese believed he had been protecting? That was only half the story. A hidden server, disconnected from any traditional network, had started blinking online, one file at a time, each containing the names of those involved, the locations of facilities thought long abandoned, and, most disturbingly, blueprints for a new wave of psychological warfare programs under a different name, with a shinier coat of legitimacy. There were no obvious villains anymore. Monroe was either buried under rubble or protected in some higher echelon of secrecy where names don't matter. What Reese did have was the truth, and with it, a choice. He could disappear forever and let someone else carry the weight, or he could become what they feared most, a survivor who doesn't just expose the rot, but tears out its roots. He chose both. Disguised under different aliases, Reese began planting stories, feeding journalists who still had a spine, connecting dots in places no one thought to look. He didn't need fame. He needed traction. And slowly he got it. The right influencer shared the right clip. A true crime channel with a loyal audience broke the timeline down. A documentarian picked it up, followed by Late. Continue from where the introduction left off, and dive deeper into the mystery. This section should provide background and context about the main character's recent activities, relationships, and any events that might explain why they are in this situation. Slowly introduce red herrings and potential suspects to keep the audience guessing. Maintain the suspenseful tone and build tension without revealing too much. Keep the wording natural and engaging, ensuring it flows seamlessly. Avoid any headings, one-line statements, or short sentences. Stick to large paragraphs only. Keep the audience hooked by adding more layers of uncertainty. Write the content by targeting US audience. Use the keywords which are trending on YouTube search.